It's so nice and cold this morning. Anyone else love it? Yeah. Like it felt so comfortable. It's so nice. I think the high is 71. Like that's amazing. That's literally like 40 degrees colder than it was like a week and a half ago. So I'll take that. I'll take that. Everyone have a good weekend. I lost like half my fantasy football team to injury. Like everybody on my team got hurt this week. Both of my quarterbacks are gone. My running back's gone. Cooper Cup's gone. Like everybody got hurt.
Don't remind me. It's like that's around kind of like.
For Puka now, Cooper.
Well, Puka was already injured.
I know.
But I was just like.
True.
Now it's like season over.
I know. Hopefully Cup's is short injury. We'll see. It's his ankle. Hard to say. Oh. But we did win our first soccer game, so I was excited about that.
Nice.
My little ones won their game. I was so nervous the whole time. I was like, please don't get stomped into the ground, right? But we won, so I was excited for that. 2-0. That's not too bad. We didn't blow them out. They didn't blow them out. Anyway, I have a couple of things I want to talk about, but I'm going to wait till the end to talk about that first part of the paper, the exam that's coming up. So I'll talk about all of that kind of at the end of our time today. Otherwise, we have one more chapter to go before we finish this first unit. Hard to believe we're already almost like getting close to a third of the way through the semester. It feels like it's going really quickly. This is week 6 this morning, I believe, right? It's definitely flying by. It feels fast, like it's mid-September already. It's crazy. But we'll look at disorders of trauma and stress today. Hopefully nobody is feeling like this poor little guy up here. He looks very stressed out. But we'll look at the stress response and then some of the common stress disorders, talking about trauma and disorders that tend to come from trauma. And that will be our focus for this week. So starting with stress. Right. Stress is something that we all experience. Every single one of us experiences stress. It can be caused by literally anything that causes stress. We call it a stressor, right? That could be an exam or a paper. Sorry to give you 2 items of stress over here. It could be technology. It could be traffic. It could be timing. It could be money. It could be literally anything. And the interesting thing about stress is it's more than the event itself. Kind of like how we decide to react to it, how we perceive the event. 2 people can have the exact same stressor and respond very differently. Like, for example, sitting in traffic doesn't tend to make me mad or stressed because I'm always ridiculously early at everything, right? Versus my partner in traffic gets very irritated and angry. My kids will start like saying stuff when we get into traffic. I'm like, I know what that's going to be, right? Everybody responds differently to the same kind of stress. And what we see is that it's that appraisal and the reactions that happen in our system that then cause issues. So a little bit of stress isn't a problem. Stress can actually be somewhat motivating if we have a little bit of it. But when it crosses a threshold and becomes too much is when we get disorders related to stress and trauma. And that's what we'll focus on in this chapter. So let's, I have a little video. I want to talk a little bit about how stress affects the body just for a minute, as hopefully a little bit of a reminder or a refresher from intro psych. But I have a little video that introduces this and then I'll come right back to this slide. And again, when we experience stress and you can see like the poor little guy, like running, getting redder, having these reactions, stress does affect the body a lot. And people who have chronic stress really struggle sometimes with the outcomes of all of those things that are going on in our body. So whenever we have a stressor, as they mentioned in there, and just to kind of put it in a couple of different ways, whenever there's something that stresses you out, your hypothalamus is the first system or the first part of your body and brain that is kicked into gear. So the hypothalamus is a small little structure in the limbic system that regulates homeostasis. Homeostasis means balance. Right, so basically like a little red flag goes off that there's a stressor and the hypothalamus is activated and in turn causes a huge chain reaction to occur. So the hypothalamus triggers or activates 2 different systems within the body. One of them is our autonomic nervous system and the other is our endocrine system. And both of them work a little bit differently and have different kind of things that they're in charge of, but both of them are activated by that small structure called the hypothalamus. The autonomic nervous system is in charge of a lot of our like involuntary activities. Autonomic sounds a lot like automatic. That was always how I remembered it. It's like automatic stuff that you don't even necessarily think about, right? Like breathing and heart rate and like things that are very like automatic functions. The endocrine system is a big system of glands that releases hormones throughout our body. So the nervous system is going to kick into gear on one side and the endocrine system on the other. And I'm going to break this down a little more, but if you were wondering, where is the autonomic nervous system? I have kind of a reference for you here. So our nervous system is divided into two main branches, and hopefully this is all reviewed from intro psych. We have the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. All the other nerves that branch out from those two things in the body. And so the peripheral divides again, and one of those is the autonomic nervous system, which is what we have up here, controlling our organs, our glands, or like internal, like automatic stuff. And it divides one more time as well, right? So lots of divisions of the nervous system. So we could add here, we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic is in charge of arousing us whenever we have a threat, right? It's in charge of fight or flight. Now we have like fawn, freeze. We have all these other Fs that we've started to add. And the parasympathetic calms us down when a threat has passed. So what happens is when this side is activated, when the autonomic nervous system, which you can see is right over here, is activated, it arouses us for that fight or flight response. It kicks into gear, causing our breathing to change, our heart rate to change. We start to sweat. We get like all amped up and aroused as we are prepared to like fight something off. And that could be something like an exam, or it could be something more immediate and traumatic, but it's kind of a huge range of stressors, right? It can be mild to severe, but it causes a bunch of different neurotransmitters to be released into our system. Things like norepinephrine, for example. Really common one that's related here, or GABA. Right, a bunch of different neurotransmitters are released into our body, and we feel those, right? And some of those can be out of proportion. We've talked about norepinephrine and GABA as it relates to anxiety disorders. If we are out of balance with these things, we feel it. We feel it in our mind, we feel it in our emotions, and we feel it in our body. So we have this whole like nervous system pathway. And then when we calm down, the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge of resting and digesting, which sounds way better than fighting or flighting, right? Rest and digest. I'll choose that one. But it calms us back down once that threat has passed, right? And then our body returns to normal. On the other side of this system, the endocrine system has what we can call glands and the HPA pathway. A bunch of different glands in our body are in charge of releasing hormones. So instead of neurotransmitters here, we have hormones which go into our bloodstream, things like adrenaline and cortisol. And from this HPA pathway, right, we have everything going from the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal pathway is releasing all of these hormones through the adrenal glands, through all the different glands in our system, causing these hormones to have a very global effect. So the long story short of this here is that when we experience stress, it might not seem like a lot is happening, but all of this is happening in your system. It's this ongoing process of neurotransmitters and hormones being released, and then the threat passes and we calm back down. But some people, when we experience something like a trauma, for example, these things are always going, right? They're always in gear. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the disorders here in a minute, but all of these things don't reset the way that they would for somebody who didn't have that trauma response. So with things like PTSD or complex PTSD or dissociative disorders that we'll get into as well, all of this stuff is constantly going, making you exhausted, making it hard for you to function and concentrate and all sorts of other things. Before I go to that, oops, sorry, I'm just pushing buttons here. Before I get to those, are there any questions or comments or thoughts, anything here? Just again, the point is, there's a lot happening in our system when we're stressed, even if it doesn't appear so on the surface. So one of the big parts of this chapter is looking at the concept of trauma, right? And this is something that has become a really big area of study right now in psychology. Trauma and the effects on our body and on our system is something that is like a big buzz topic right now, right? And there's a lot of books being written about it, a lot of like research being done on it. One of the leading like experts and one of the leading books that I would definitely recommend if this interests you is called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der, right? And he's kind of one of the like leading experts in the field at the moment, talking about how the body reacts to things like trauma and how it can literally rewire your nervous system if it happens at a young age, and that it might take years of undoing to fix it. So he talks a lot about this idea of emotional trauma, some kind of extraordinarily stressful event or experience that leaves you feeling unsafe or helpless. Can also sometimes cause you physical harm. So sometimes people experience a physical traumatic event or an emotionally traumatic event, and it has a footprint that it leaves on you, right? It has after effects that can linger for years, right? And so what happens is when we have traumatic stress, it causes changes in this whole pathway, right? And so what this book talks about, not the easiest read, it's a little bit like complicated, but it talks about how trauma can really impact our body and our brain and our emotions. And then it goes into things like how we can fix that through various therapeutic approaches like EMDR, which we'll talk about, and things like that. So I want to play, I found a little video of him. He's kind of talking about this concept of trauma, and I thought that was really interesting. But I wanted to recommend that book if you're interested in more reading. It's, again, a very like contemporary book. But here is Bessel van der guy, and again, kind of at the forefront of this research right now. And as I mentioned, quite a few books, right? His is really regarded as like the kind of gold standard when it comes to this topic, but talking about how these things can be affected, right? He talked about endocrine system issues, nervous system issues, right? They come from trauma. And in his opinion, especially when people have like childhood trauma, when you have trauma as a young kid, where you don't have people there to help shield you or like help you deal with the trauma that happened, it can really lead to some long-term issues. So again, just kind of a recommendation if you want it. Any like thoughts or comments, anything here before I keep going? Yeah. I mean, it depends, like, so if it's affecting your life, right, and it's a disorder, like we could maybe put it under that category. Like stress in itself isn't considered a disorder.
Like what? Yeah, I'll say what I'm like stressed about.
Yeah,
Would that just be like,
it could be, right? So remember we talked about generalized anxiety disorder, right? So if everything causes you anxiety, then it could be something like that. Stress, like I said, by itself. So unless you have like an extreme stressor or lots of smaller ones, particularly when you're younger, that have like an ongoing effect, it's not considered a disorder, right? So we all have stress. Like for me, you know, like certain days of the week are way more stressful than others, right? And dealing with that stress isn't considered problematic. But when it spills over and it's causing you issues, then it could be. But you have to look at, is it the stressors or is it your reactions and anticipation of things? Like that is the issue, right? It's tricky, and stress in itself isn't necessarily a disorder unless it's chronic or severe. Any other thoughts, comments, anything? Oops. So there are a couple of disorders that are directly connected to trauma, right? And the big one that I know a lot of you have, I'm sure you've heard of, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's also one called acute stress disorder. And these two disorders are the exact same. All the symptoms are the same. The only difference is how long they last and how quickly they start. Okay, so acute stress disorder is something that happens very soon after a traumatic event. So let's say you get into a really awful car crash And within a matter of days or like a couple of weeks, you start showing a bunch of signs of like a traumatic response. If it happens within 4 weeks and lasts less than a month, we call it acute stress disorder. If it starts later or lasts longer, then it's categorized as PTSD. So again, they are the exact same except for how soon it starts and how long it lasts. So it might be that somebody's diagnosed with acute stress disorder, and then if it goes beyond the month mark, we change it to PTSD, right? And that happens sometimes. So the way that I've always remembered this, and it might not be the most like sensitive way of remembering it, but it's just a cute little stress disorder, right? It's smaller, right? And that means it doesn't last as long, right? And obviously nothing cute about it, but given the name, that might help you remember it. Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about complex. So typically post-traumatic stress disorder is one traumatic event, right? Or like one cluster of traumatic events. Complex is a bunch of smaller ones, but we'll get there in a minute. Yeah, that one's a newer one that we don't technically recognize in the DSM yet, but I would be shocked if it's not in the next one. So with both of these, people are having all these different symptoms of something traumatic. So you experience a traumatic event and then you re-experience it afterward in some way. And if you were to experience a trauma, I would argue that it's very normal for you to react to it. So let's say you get in a car accident. Every time you get in your car for a few weeks after that, you're probably going to feel some anxiety, maybe some fear. That's totally normal. It might even be for years that when you go through the intersection or the place where the accident happened, that you tense up or you get nervous. My partner got into a car accident like 15 years ago where she was turning left at a light and someone just plowed right into her, right? They ran the light and plowed into her. And every time she has to turn left at a light, I see her go like this, just a tiny bit, just like tense up. Like nothing, I wouldn't say that qualifies as like a disorder. That's a normal reaction. When bad things happen, it's normal to react to them. But with both of these, especially PTSD, you have a much longer lasting effect to it. So you start experiencing things like the traumatic event keeps coming up for you. Maybe you have dreams about it or flashbacks of it, or you keep thinking about it when you don't want to. You avoid anything that might remind you of the event. Right? So if it happened in the car, maybe you don't get in the car. Something traumatic happened at night, you don't go out at night, right? Or you go out at night at like a great personal cost, right? It causes you a lot of fear and anxiety. People tend to get what's called hypervigilance. They're always on edge. Little things tend to set them off, right? If you were in combat, which is where this came from, originated with combat. It used to be called shell shock syndrome until we realized that it could happen to people outside of combat as well. But the stereotype of this is like a firework goes off or a car backfires and somebody instantly reacts like they're back in combat. It's kind of like the stereotypical presentation of this. But you're hyper aroused, you have a lot of anxiety and guilt, sometimes anger, or you can become very withdrawn and antisocial. That sometimes happens as well. But the idea, I always think about it this way, it's almost like that event haunts you, right? You can't get rid of it. You have, as I said, nightmares or flashbacks. It comes up for you all the time. Anyone have someone in your life with PTSD? Any like comments or stories or anything about people in your life? Is that a yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And that's really common for veterans, right? Anyone who's been in combat, the sounds sound a lot like explosives, right? And we can remind people of combat. Combat is still the #1 reason for PTSD, right? Even though it can be anything, right? Combat is a very like triggering traumatic event for a lot of people. Anyone else? Any other? Yeah.
You know, it's so hard to be
Yeah.
Anytime that happens, for like a lot of day, you see his hand quickly go to his hip. Like searching around. And I'm like, dude, we're in like the suburbs, like it's okay or not.
Right.
So like every time that happens.
It's an instant reaction, right? Like reaching for it. It's almost like reflexive in a way. Yeah. Yeah, and that can be very much how it shows up for people. I had a client when I was working to be a therapist. I had a client whose partner, it wasn't even her, right? And that you can have secondary trauma. Her partner was attacked, getting into her car at night. And my client became so afraid of this happening to her that she wouldn't go out in the evening, right? And that's that like avoidance piece, right? And it can be secondary. It doesn't have to happen directly to you. But typically the way that this manifests is that it's someone who's in a traumatic event and then it happens to them. And again, the common triggers, the most common one by a mile is combat, but it can be a natural disaster, like some kind of assault or attack. It could be terrorism. It could be anything, or anything that you perceive or experience to be traumatic. And then it affects you, right, in an ongoing way, activating all of this constantly because these things have been thrown out of whack. Is that a hand again?
Could death cause PTSD?
Somebody,
Like death of somebody.
sure, yeah.
What would that fall
So it can fall under PTSD, right? So let's say, I had another client whose dad passed away, and she was stuck in the room with her dad after he had died for a couple of hours before they took him out and like kind of like moved forward. And that was a traumatic event for her. Like she kept having dreams about it. It was affecting like, things that made her want to avoid anything related to like death. So if somebody near you dies and is traumatic for you in some way, it could fall here, right? For sure, or it could become a phobia. It could go either way. Yeah.
Can that trigger like not the eating disorder, but the
Yeah. With eating.
that happens to
Mhm. Oftentimes people are emotional eaters, right? Like, as a, go ahead, what did you eat?
my uncle passed a few years ago.
Yeah.
They had to like stay in the house.
Yeah.
And it's my cousin specifically could not be, but it
Yeah.
wasn't like the weight. Even if somebody was just like food, so protection from that.
Yeah. And it's really
That
common.
feels like me.
It's-
PTSD.
It's tricky because if it's only eating, right, but that's not an uncommon reaction to death. Right, so sometimes when people pass, as they're dealing with the grief, they don't eat. Other people eat way too much, right, as a way to like fill their hole. So you have to look at how long it lasts, right? Is it that the only thing, is it only eating or is it other stuff as well? So you kind of have to look at the big picture, but the duration piece is huge. So if that goes on for just a few weeks, I would say that's totally normal. It's not a disorder, it's just a grieving response. But if it persists afterward, it could become an eating disorder, it could be this, right? So you kind of have to look at the whole picture. But not eating after, like, as you're grieving, it is a pretty common thing, especially if it's just like a short-term thing.
My grandmother, a good couple of years ago now, she got into a really bad accident. She's definitely kind of worked her way back into being able to, get in the cars and go on rides and everything. I could tell that she still is a bit like anxious sometimes, like if we break like a little bit, she'll like, all that, but she won't drive, like,
Yeah,
ever, like for the life of her, she will not drive. Even though she's still willing to get in the cars and go on rides and all that, would that still be considered avoidance?
Yeah.
Or just?
it could be, yeah. Yeah, and this, like everything else, exists on a spectrum, right? So avoidance could be refusing to drive, but you'll get into a car, but you're still like super anxious, you're on edge the whole time, right? Like when you're in that car. And so that could be like a milder case of PTSD. Some people have it so severely that they can't function, especially if it's like earlier in their progression of the disease. And other people got tired of waiting for me. Other people, it can be so like mild that they can still function, but it pops up under certain circumstances and like getting in a car, for example. So I would say, yeah, that still definitely qualifies, just maybe on like the milder. Hopefully it'll come back here in a minute. So you talked about complex PTSD. This is one that has actually gained a lot of, and it'll come back in a second, sorry. There we go. Complex PTSD or CPTSD is something that is gaining a lot of traction as well. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is not in the DSM yet. Okay, so it's not recognized officially, But it is something that is often discussed and talked about, and likely will make it into the next one because it's become such a buzz topic. Looking at people who've had a series of traumatic events, often occurring or beginning in childhood, right? So the thought here is this is typically typically going back to when you were very young, that you experienced a bunch of different things happening to you, and they might be small events, but it adds up in total. I have a little video that introduces this. Let me play it for you, and then we'll come back to this slide. But PTSD. So PTSD is typically something over a shorter period of time. This tends to be something that's much longer lasting, repeated smaller injuries, typically thought to be related to childhood. So we see a lot of things like emotional neglect or physical abuse when you were younger. Emotional neglect is a big one that tends to pop up here. It might not come up as or seem like something that is super traumatic on the surface, but long-term emotional neglect or not being cared for properly, as they mentioned, creates this idea of a lack of safety. And so what you get is issues with the way you perceive yourself. Emotional flashbacks are common here. So with PTSD, you might have a flashback where you're instantly back, kind of like you were describing of the cars go off and you reach for that gun, or fireworks and so on. Emotional flashbacks are more of a feeling, right? So maybe something about the current moment brings up old feelings from when you were younger, and it kind of takes you back to things that happened. So you have a lot of lesser traumas that have happened to you. It can lead to difficulty with relationships, difficulties feeling safe, trusting others. This one's a little harder to treat because it tends to be, instead of one event, it's quite a few. So again, this is something that you might see in future versions of the DSM. We've also started calling it developmental trauma disorder. So I've seen it put both ways, or DTD. Complex PTSD or developmental trauma disorder, they're kind of the same thing. They're still sort of debating on a name, but you'll definitely see more of this as we move forward. So why do people develop stress disorders? Right? A trauma is traumatic, right? When you have something traumatic happen to us, as I mentioned earlier, it's only natural that you would respond, but not everybody who has a traumatic event happen to them develops PTSD or ASD or CPTSD or whatnot, right? So why do some and not others? And we have, as always in psychology, a whole host of suggested ideas. One is that it might be somewhat genetic, right? Maybe PTSD and your susceptibility to respond to it in a more severe way is somewhat genetic. Maybe there are stronger chemical responses in those nervous systems and systems we put up here in people who have these disorders. So it's thought that there's some biological or genetic elements to it. Personality-wise, maybe certain personality types are more prone to negative responses to stress. It could be that the way that you interact with the world and your views on the world is powerful enough to shape your reactions. So maybe different personality types have different propensities toward these mental illnesses. Childhood experience is another big one, and this relates especially to that CPTSD. When you grow up in environments that are marked by poverty or abuse, any kind of assault or lack of safety, having those things as a child puts you at a greater vulnerability for things like CPTSD and PTSD as an adult. Those who have better social support tend to do better, right? If you have people you can rely on, that tends to be a big insulating factor, a resiliency factor protecting you. Again, multicultural factors, like growing up in certain socioeconomic statuses tends to be more dangerous. There are differences among ethnic groups, right? So we see that certain ethnic groups tend to have different beliefs. For example, Hispanic culture tends to have a very negative view of mental illness and mental health, right? Very common from that cultural belief, and I can speak to this being married to someone of that culture, very common to be well, just stop it, just suck it up, move on, right? You don't go to therapy, you don't talk about your feelings.
Or it doesn't exist.
Or it doesn't exist, it's not a thing. right? Very common within certain cultures. You're nodding, right? Like different cultural beliefs have different mentalities about how you cope with mental illness. Some being more supportive stereotypically than others. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Mhm.
I used to like that I appreciate.
Yeah. Yes, you have these interactions between ethnicity, religion, and the beliefs that come out of them can very much shape like your family culture around trauma, around mental illness in general. And then obviously the severity of the trauma. The more severe the trauma, the higher the likelihood is that you might require treatment or develop a disorder. And so lots of different factors. Not everyone who experiences trauma develops PTSD or ASD or CPTSD. Some people are okay. They have a short-term reaction and they move on and they're fine. Others might require treatment or battle it for quite some time. One of the most common treatments now, this is something that has gained a lot of popularity in the last 10 years. We can obviously use medications to help people, but most of the time in order to treat these disorders effectively, you have to come to grips with the experience in some way. And that's typically done through therapy, or therapy can take the form of what we call EMDR. Very common for stress and trauma disorders. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This is a really interesting form of therapy that in a way forces you to face the trauma head on. You have to think about it head on while also activating like different parts of the brain through like this, through some kind of stimulation. So sometimes it can be done with tappers. You hold little buzzers in your hands and they buzz in an alternating way. The old standby is to stare at a light that goes back and forth like this, or a therapist's finger. It used to just be that a therapist would go like this, but they were getting like arm problems and shoulder problems. One strong arm, right, for like doing this all day. So now we have light bars where you stare at a light that goes back and forth while thinking about the traumatic event. And the way that it's thought to activate the brain while also dealing with it is thought to be helpful in a way beyond just talking about it. Again, I have one more little video that introduces this. I find these and I think they're helpful. Hopefully you find them helpful too, but on both sides of EMDR, right? So I have administered EMDR and I have received EMDR. And usually as part of training to do this, you have to go through it yourself as well. So one thing I would add that they didn't say in the video is that it often gets worse before it gets better, right? And they showed that little like scale and it just slowly went down. That's a beautiful thought, but sometimes it goes up before it goes down, right? And so if you're dealing with something traumatic and you go in and you're working on EMDR, you're bringing up that trauma and then you have to sit with it, right? Until it's worked through. So those 3 months or whatever they said that you're dealing with it, which is kind of a rough like framework. If you go in and you're dealing with a traumatic event, you leave with that traumatic event kind of dug up. And you have to do that week after week after week until it gets better. So sometimes it gets a little bit worse throughout that process. But the idea is that you change it from something really powerful. You unstick it in the brain. And Vander Kolk talked a lot about this as well. The thought is that something about that traumatic event didn't get processed or digested in the brain. And so through EMDR, you're digesting it, breaking it apart, and that allows you to then move on from it. So that's kind of the idea behind it. Usually it's moving your eyes. Some people like to close their eyes and hold buzzers, but the standby is usually like following fingers or a light bar while thinking about a traumatic event and kind of changing the way you think about it. Yeah, comments or thoughts or questions or anything here? Anything about EMDR? It's probably one of the leading treatments for stress disorders, like the ones we talked about. Yeah. Yeah, it can, right? It's so funny that you mentioned that. So I have something called aphantasia. You can't say anything either. So the second you said that, it made me think of that. So aphantasia is when you're not able to picture things in your mind, right? And I don't have it all the way. Like some people have it completely, where like if I asked you to close your eyes and think of an apple, right? So do that real quick. Close your eyes and picture an apple. How many of you instantly, you can open your eyes, how many of you instantly could see an apple in your mind? Yeah. Anyone to take a second to kind of build the apple, but you can find it, you can get there? Okay. So people who have aphantasia cannot picture an apple. Like if you ask them to close their eyes and picture it, maybe they can't picture it at all. For me, I have it in a mild way. I picture a photograph of an apple, right? I can't picture an actual apple, but I can see an image of one that I've looked at somewhere. I can kind of construct it, but it takes time. I've been married to my wife for 21 years, right? We've been together for a long time. If you ask me to close my eyes and picture her, I can't picture her moving as like a real like life individual. I picture the last photograph I took of her, right? It's really interesting, really like not super common. It seems like you have that as well. This can still work. And so what they often do, instead of focusing on an image, you focus on a feeling in your body, right? And so like, where do you feel that trauma in your body? And let's focus on that instead of an image if you can't come up with it, right? So it sounds like you have it all the way, right? Where you, yeah. So what is that like for you?
Like the apple thing?
Yeah.
Apple, I put an apple.
Yeah.
I can't see it.
Yeah.
And I think like past memories or things like that, like I don't know, I'm not confident with something, somebody I went with can tell me exactly how it looked like.
Mhm.
It's like I see shadows of what it was.
Sure.
But it's like a process and image that was happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that is, interestingly, sometimes related to trauma too, right? There's a lot we're still learning about it, but that's called aphantasia. I wrote it up here just as a side note. And it can be a whole continuum. So for you, I can't picture anything. For me, I can picture like a video or a photograph, but not the actual thing. And again, it's kind of on a whole spectrum. Really interesting to read about too. Like if you, as a side note, want to know more about that, that's an interesting topic. But yeah, you focus on a body sensation instead.
I love reading. So you could like imagine. Like, I have my own, like, yeah, I can just sort of immerse whenever you're reading, it's just you can't see it.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because I've always had poor reading comprehension, and I blame that on the fact that I can't picture like what I'm like, because my partner's an English teacher, and we'll read a book, and she always quizzes our kids like as we're reading the book, like we're reading The Hobbit with them right now. And like she'll be like, so what's happening in this chapter? What's this? What's that? And I know because of the movies, right? But like listening, I'm like, oh, good. I'm glad they're answering, not me, right? Like I have the worst reading comprehension. I have to read things multiple times because I can't picture it the same way. And for some, it doesn't seem to bother them, but for I blame my poor reading comprehension on this, right? Or it just could just be me. The other half of this chapter has to do with the dissociative disorders. These are wildly interesting disorders, not the most common, but they do happen. Dissociative disorders are often rooted in trauma, which is why they're here, extreme stress or trauma. And with these, what we get is like memory loss, changes of identity, feeling like the world around you isn't real, right? Feeling disconnected from yourself. There's a bunch of different like little things here. Dissociative amnesia, where you forget due to something traumatic. Dissociative identity disorder, where we have multiple personalities that might emerge as a result or reaction to trauma. So these disorders have things to do with like your identity, your memory, and your processing of the world around you, right? So maybe things feeling unreal or feeling like very like different, or even creating other identities because of something traumatic that happened. So there's kind of a whole host of things under this umbrella as well, very, very connected to trauma and stress. Let me erase this. So one of the types of dissociative disorders is something called dissociative amnesia. So have you ever heard of cases where like people hit their head and then they forget? Right? That's called retrograde amnesia. Like let's say you have a physical trauma, like you get in a car accident, you have head trauma, you can't remember what happened to you because you hit your head. That is different than dissociative amnesia. Dissociative amnesia is when people have memory loss without a physical or organic cause. So the trauma is emotional, not physical. All right, so let's say you get in a car accident and hit your head and forget, that's retrograde amnesia. You have something really traumatic happen to you emotionally, and you forget, that's dissociative amnesia. You dissociate yourself from the event and you forget it. And that can happen in 5 different ways. And I won't ask you the difference between these, but these would be a great short answer question. What are the 5 different types of dissociative amnesia? So it can be localized, selective, generalized, continuous, or something called a dissociative fugue. When it's localized, what that means is it starts like with the disturbance. So a lot of people, for example, when 9/11 happened, they said that the second that the attack started, they couldn't remember anything that happened afterward. Right. So with localized, it tends to begin with like the disturbance. Maybe you remember the days before it, the days after it, but not what happened during the traumatic time. Selective is the most common. You remember bits and pieces. Okay, so you remember how you got out of the building, but you don't remember what happened next, or you don't remember what happened right before, right? You kind of remember bits and pieces of a traumatic event, but some of it has been blocked out. Generalized and continuous are really rare. They can happen, but they're really, really rare. Generalized is when you forget everything before the trauma, right? So maybe you forget who you are, you forget your identity, you forget like stuff that happened before a traumatic event. And continuous is when you forget everything since. You can't store or hold on to new information and new memories. Both of these very, very rare. The first 2 relatively common. And typically your memory comes back. It's just a matter of time. Now this last one is really interesting. Fugue is Latin for flight. Not necessarily to get on a plane, but to run or flee, right? To take off and run. And with a disassociative fugue, people oftentimes leave home, they forget who they are, and they start a brand new identity or partial identity somewhere else, right? And this pops up in the news every now and then, right? And it typically comes back. It might be a few hours, might be a few days, might be a few weeks. But people typically like very quickly now, as you don't have the documentation to support it, it's like, I don't know who I am. I don't know where it came from. It's not on purpose. It's just like your mind kind of enters a foggy state and you typically take off, go somewhere else and start a new like life or a new situation without any memory for the past. Yeah. No, so dementia is like a very like long, slow process. We'll talk about this when we get to disorders of aging. So dementia typically only happens, not always, but it's typical in people like 65 and older. This is actually more common in people who are younger or like in the middle ages. And it's very trauma based versus dementia is very biologically progressing and slowly over time. The fog part of it, maybe, but the memory comes back. So which it might not. So some little threads in common, but they tend to manifest very differently. Yeah.
The state kind of tied in with the name, like.
It could be, it's more like extreme stress. So people get pushed to their limit and it's almost like something shuts off and they just take off. Like literally like often leaving home, that flight term. So I found a news story of this that might help make it a little more clear. And this guy, like sometimes this happens more than once. Like people who have this tend to do it repeatedly. Memory comes back like in bits and pieces, but it could take a couple of days. It's almost like you've entered into like a fog and you don't remember who you are. People tend to catch on to it quickly because they don't have anything to support this new identity. But it is something that is really odd. It feels purposeful, but it's not. It's like this unconscious reaction, so usually due to stress and trauma. Yeah.
Is another good example Jason Bourne?
Yeah, so that would be like the generalized, right? He can't remember who he is before the like trauma, right? So yeah, I always think of him as well, but his case, it's a little like blurry, and they kind of blend some stuff, but on the surface. Yeah.
They forget everything, and why they don't they can reading, writing.
Yeah, well, no, it's just identity based, so they can still read and write and all of those things, but they forget who they are. So strange that your brain could do that, right? It's like you forget your personal identity, but those long-term concrete skills are still there, right? Really not something that we understand very well, but that's kind of the case with all of these, right? With all of the disorders in this second part here, like we'll talk about next time. You don't know who you are, you're like separate from others of yourself, or you have other identities, and we don't fully understand, but it's something related to trauma that makes us have that reaction. Okay? Really wild. Our brains are wild in the things that it can do or can't do sometimes. Before I run out of time, I want to talk a little bit. I wrote a couple of things up here just in our closing minutes here. I want to remind you of a few things that I'll pick up and we can go into it next time. But remember that first part of the paper is due tonight. Okay, and like 10 of you have already turned it in, which is fantastic. It's worth 10 points. Okay, but it's an easy 10 points. It's literally like a paragraph of which character you're choosing and why. And then the citation information for your show. So who produced it, what's the name of the show, the year. Doesn't have to be in any particular format, but you are typing it and turning it in. So if you're here on Canvas and you click on assignments, you can see right here. So diagnosis paper part 1, character show and selection. And here's where you would click to turn it in, right? So all the instructions are here, but again, it's like less than a page, but it should be typed with your show and character information and like a short description of why. And you can always change this later, but I think that the sooner you commit to a character, the easier your life will be. But definitely be thinking about that. That is due by tonight. The other thing I want to talk about just for a minute, so there's a small chance that I might have to cancel class Wednesday. I'm hoping not, but my daughter in school, if there's something going on there. But just in case, I want to just kind of talk about this just for a moment, just in case. Hopefully that's not a reality. But our first exam is coming up on Monday. And if you are looking at the syllabus, you can see that it's on there. And it's right here on our site. If you click on quizzes, here's exam number 1. And what will happen is we don't have normal class on Monday, and you can see that on the syllabus. So there's no class here, no in person. And the reason for that is I'm letting you take the exam online. And so you can take it at this scheduled time. You have 8:30 to 9:45 free. Or if you would rather sleep in and take it a little later, that's totally fine. It just has to be done by 11:59 p.m. that night. It'll basically open at 12:01 a.m., close at 11:59 p.m. So you have the entire span of the day to complete it. But once it closes, it's gone, right? So please make sure you do it sometime that day. If something comes up, you have an emergency, you got to reach out to me before that deadline, and then I'm happy to work with you on it. Okay? Yeah. No, it'll be on Monday, right? So we won't have in-person class. So at the very least, you have this time free, but totally fine if you want to take it sometime later in the day and sleep in. I would probably opt for that if it were me, but it's up to you. You have a study guide on here. So if you go to modules, I gave you a study guide for all 3 exams. And so if we click on study guide 1, what you'll see is a list of terms. And if it's on the study guide, it will be on the exam. If it's not on the study guide, you don't need to know it. Okay. So anything that's on here, the first exams on chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the 5 that we've covered so far. So if it's on here, for example, stress, make sure you could define that. You could answer questions about it. The exam is mainly multiple choice, matching, and true false, but there are some short answer questions at the end. They will never be essays, never, but it could be like, what are the 5 types of dissociative amnesia, right? Which is like, right, where is it? Right here, 5 types of dissociative amnesia, right? So any of those lists are things that I love for short answer questions. Because it's online, you can use your notes, you can use your book, you can use anything that you've prepared to help you on the exam. So if it were me, right, and I am like one of those like ridiculously like I'm mad if I miss one question on an exam kind of people. If it were me, what I would do is I would type up or write out everything on the study guide, make sure that I knew it, I'd review it, and then I'd have it in front of me during the exam. Right, so that you don't get to like, I don't know, acute stress disorder, and there's a question about it, and then you're like, I don't remember, and you're trying to flip through the book and flip through your notes, and you're using up that time. If you have it all in a study guide, you can just reference it very easily. So if it were me, I would over prepare for exam 1, if you've never taken a test with me before. And you can always dial it back on the next one if you find that you didn't need to do that much. I just want to add that I will never trick you on an exam. You'll never have a trick question. Those are stupid. They just cause anxiety. If you know everything on the study guide, you will do well on the exam. They're very straightforward, probably easier than it should be, but please prepare, please study. We recommend doing the study guide. There was a hand, yeah.
You said how many questions there?
It says on the, let me see, I don't remember off the top of my head, but if you look here, it has 82 questions. Okay, so you have plenty of time. What I can tell you is the average amount of time people take is usually around 60-62 minutes. I've seen that pretty consistently. But when the clock expires, it's over. So just make sure you're kind of being mindful of the time. You can skip questions if you need to and come back to them. It's plenty of time if you studied and prepared. You're trying to look everything up if you're
How much time?
you have an hour and 15 minutes, like you would if you took them. So, and I didn't make it any harder because it's online. I switched to this during COVID, and I think it gives you a great opportunity to take the test in a less stressful environment. And I think I hope that that's something that you appreciate. I thought that it would be nice. Test anxiety is a real problem for a lot of people, and I like want to be really sensitive to that. Did you have a question too, Jenny? Okay, so hopefully I'll see you on Wednesday, but worst case, if I have to cancel Wednesday, I'll post a reminder about this. And then it'll just be that you need to kind of look at the last few slides and things for that. But hopefully that's not an issue. So by tonight, don't forget the paper. And then on Monday, we will have that exam. So we'll see you Monday either way. I'll hang out up here if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will hopefully see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye, take care.